In this chilling true crime case, we'll unravel the mind of Michael Haight, a man whose shocking actions left the world in disbelief. Was it the pressure of a perfect life, or something darker lurking beneath the surface? Stay with us as we dive deep into this twisted story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, love, and betrayal. Don't blink, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The morning was quiet. The sun was just rising. A soft orange hue filtered through the curtains. In the kitchen, the smell of brewing coffee hung in the air. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Michael Haight moved slowly. His eyes were tired. His hands, shaking slightly, gripped the cup. He stared out the window, lost in thought. The house seemed still. Too still. It was as though something had been swallowed by silence. His family was still asleep. His wife, Tasha, had been lying next to him only hours ago. The children, the laughter, the chaos, nothing stirred now. It felt unnatural. He set the coffee cup down. The clink of porcelain against wood echoed in the empty room. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the trees. The leaves rustled, but inside, nothing moved. He wiped his face, running his fingers over his rough skin. His mind was spinning. What had led him to this? What had broken inside of him? The house, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. He had been planning this. Slowly, quietly, carefully. He could hear the faint shuffle of feet upstairs. The children were waking. But it was too late. He had made his decision long ago. And now there was no turning back. The house creaked underfoot. He moved towards the stairs, his breath shallow. His pulse raced. But his face was still. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of his actions was pressing down. Upstairs, he could hear the sound of his wife stirring. He paused for a moment. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar. A low whisper of his wife's voice reached him. She was calling to him, asking him to come back to bed. The sound of her voice was almost comforting, but it did not sway him. He opened the door. Inside, the warmth of the bed made his heart pound in his chest. The children's laughter drifted in from the hallway, innocent and unaware. But Michael knew. He had already decided. His hand trembled as he reached for the drawer. The cold metal felt strange under his fingertips. The weight of it seemed to magnify. The world outside was still, and yet, inside, everything had already changed. He could hear his wife's voice again, but it was distant now. It no longer mattered. The decision was made, and the horror that would follow was already set in motion. His fingers tightened around the cold metal. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with anticipation. His heart beat loudly, like a drum in his chest. Tasha's voice was growing louder now, still unaware. But everything inside Michael felt empty. Hollow. There was no joy, no relief. Just a cold, gnawing emptiness. He glanced at the window. The sun was rising higher, painting the world in light. But it felt like darkness. His hand, still gripping the weapon, began to sweat. Every sound in the house was amplified. The creak of the floorboards. The distant sound of a clock ticking. But there was no turning back. It was too late. He opened the bedroom door fully. Tasha was sitting up now. She blinked, still groggy, unaware of the storm about to hit. Her eyes met his. For a moment, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Then she spoke softly. "Michael, what's wrong?" Her words hit him like a slap. But he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at her. And in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Her face, still familiar, was now foreign to him. He could see the concern in her eyes, but it didn't stir anything inside him. The weapon in his hand felt like an extension of his own body. Cold. Unforgiving. And then, without warning, the silence shattered. The first shot rang out. The sound was deafening. Tasha's eyes went wide, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. She gasped, a look of confusion and fear flashing across her face. But it was too late. Another shot followed. The children screamed from down the hall. But Michael didn't move. He didn't feel the chaos. Didn't feel the world breaking apart around him. His eyes remained fixed on her. Tasha crumpled onto the bed, a faint whimper escaping her lips. Her blood stained the sheets. But Michael just stood there, cold, unmoving. The seconds stretched on, filled with tension. Outside, the world continued on. The wind still whispered. But inside, everything had shattered. The house seemed to hold its breath. Time was frozen, yet Michael moved with mechanical precision. His eyes never left Tasha, though her body lay still, crumpled in a heap on the bed. The children's cries echoed down the hallway. The sound of their fear clawed at him, but it didn't break his focus. He turned slowly, his feet dragging, as though the weight of what he had done was beginning to settle in. The hallway stretched out in front of him like a long, narrow tunnel. Each step felt heavy, like wading through thick mud. His pulse thundered in his ears as he approached the children's room. Their laughter from earlier seemed like a distant memory. He hesitated just outside the door. The sound of small feet shuffling inside, voices muffled, broke through the fog in his mind. They were unaware, innocent. They had no idea what had already happened. His breath caught in his throat. For the briefest moment, he thought of stopping, but it was too late. He couldn't stop now. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The children looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. The youngest, a girl with blonde pigtails, smiled. "Hi, Daddy," she chirped, her voice light, full of joy. It was like a knife to his chest. His hands trembled again. The weapon felt heavier than before, as though it were suffocating him. But he stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. They still didn't understand. He could see the confusion in their faces as he approached. They didn't understand what was coming. The sound of their tiny footsteps, the innocent giggles, felt like they were coming from far away. He stood in the doorway, watching them for a long moment. And then, without another word, he raised his hand. The first shot cut through the air. The little girl cried out, her body jerking back from the impact. But the scream was short-lived. The room went quiet. The second shot followed. The sound of silence was all-consuming. The world outside kept spinning. But inside, everything had ended. The silence in the room was suffocating. The air thick with the smell of blood, the metallic scent lingering. Michael's hand, still gripping the weapon, trembled. His eyes fixed on the lifeless bodies of his children. The innocence that had once filled this house was gone, replaced by something cold and dark. He could hear the distant wail of sirens now, but it felt like it was happening in another world. He didn't move. His heart pounded, but there was no relief, no release. Just the stillness. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. And yet, it wasn't regret he felt. It was emptiness, as if the very act of murder had hollowed him out. He had taken everything. His family, his life, their future. The light outside seemed almost mocking, shining so brightly in contrast to the darkness inside the house. The world kept turning, but here, in this house, nothing would ever be the same again. His breathing was shallow now, labored, as though his body was finally realizing what his mind had refused to accept. The coldness of the metal against his skin began to feel alien. He wanted to drop it, but his fingers wouldn't obey. He took a slow step backward, his eyes never leaving the children. Their small faces were frozen in fear, in pain. But they were gone. He could feel his heart beating, but it didn't matter. His pulse was nothing more than a reminder of how far he had fallen. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in on him, the air thick with guilt and dread. But still, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring. And the world outside, the world that hadn't been touched by this horror, continued to live on. It moved forward. But here in the house, everything had stopped. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, like a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered every thought. Michael could feel his heartbeat slowing, though it still echoed loudly in his ears. He stared at the children. The scene before him felt unreal, like he was standing outside his own body. A distant part of him wanted to run, to scream, to shake the world awake. But he didn't. He couldn't. The weight of what he had done was too heavy to bear, too final. And yet, still, there was no regret. His body was numb. His fingers, still clutching the cold metal, no longer felt like his own. He took another slow step back, retreating toward the door. But the room seemed to press in on him, the walls closing tighter with each passing second. He reached the doorway. For a brief moment, he considered fleeing. But where would he go? What would he do? There was nowhere for him to hide, no place left to run. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer. But Michael's movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if his body was too stunned to respond. He turned away from the children, their still bodies frozen in time. And yet, it was their faces that stayed with him. He couldn't escape their eyes. Their silent gaze, wide and unblinking, seemed to follow him. He stumbled down the hallway, his legs weak, unsure of where he was going. The house felt foreign now, like a place he had never known. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the floorboards louder than before. His breathing was erratic, a heavy, labored sound. The front door was just ahead. Outside, the morning light bathed everything in an almost cruel sense of normalcy. But inside, the world had shattered. His fingers brushed the door handle. He had one last moment of clarity, a fleeting thought. There was no turning back. His family was gone. And now, the only thing left for him was whatever came next. He opened the door. And the sound of the sirens, now deafening, filled the air. The cold morning air hit his face, but it did nothing to cool the fire burning in his chest. It was too late. The world had already moved on, and Michael Haight was no longer a part of it. The cold air bit at his skin, but Michael didn't feel it. He stood there for a moment, his body rigid, as if the weight of the world had pinned him in place. The sirens grew louder, closer now, their wailing filling the empty space. But he didn't move. He couldn't move. His mind, still reeling, tried to make sense of what he had done. But there was no sense to be made. He had taken everything from them. His family, the lives they had shared, the love he had once known. And now, the outside world was rushing in, bringing with it the inevitable. He could hear the crunch of tires on gravel as the police car arrived. The door was still ajar, the morning light casting long shadows across the yard. Everything outside seemed so ordinary, so calm. It was as if nothing had happened. But inside the house, the air was thick with death. The faint sound of footsteps on the gravel made Michael's pulse race. The officers were getting closer. His body still didn't obey. He just stood there, as if rooted to the spot. Then, a voice broke through the haze. "Michael, step away from the door. Don't move." It was sharp, authoritative. The voice of someone who knew. The sound of heavy boots on the porch echoed in his ears. But Michael didn't respond. His eyes, wide and vacant, stared out into the distance. For a moment, everything was quiet again, except for the distant hum of the world turning, still unaware. The officers were almost there. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The door swung wide open, and two figures stood in the doorway. "Put the weapon down," one of them ordered. Michael's fingers twitched, but he didn't let go. His grip tightened, almost as if he were clinging to the last piece of himself. But deep inside, he knew. It was over. He had no way out. The first officer stepped closer, the barrel of his gun trained on Michael. And in that moment, all the noise in the world, the sirens, the voices, the shuffling of feet, faded into the background.
It was just Michael now.
And the darkness that had taken everything from him. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the world itself had slowed to a standstill. The officer's voice echoed in the space between them. "Put the weapon down, Michael." But Michael's hands refused to obey. His fingers curled tighter around the cold metal, his knuckles turning white. The officer took another step forward, his gun still aimed. But Michael didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. In fact, he didn't feel anything at all. The sirens outside had stopped their wailing, but in his mind, they still screamed. The world around him blurred into a distorted mess of shapes and colors. The only thing clear was the weight in his hands, and the weight of his actions. A cold emptiness settled over him like a shroud, pressing down on his chest. His gaze drifted back to the house, to the bodies inside, to the family he had destroyed. The memories of laughter, the warmth of their smiles, they were gone. Vanished just like that. Everything that had ever mattered was now lost to him. And still, the officer stood there waiting. There was nothing left to say. No words to make it right. Michael's heart hammered in his chest, but it felt distant, like it wasn't even his. For a moment, he thought of the children again, their innocent eyes, their bright faces. But it was too late for that. There was nothing left for him in this world. The officer's voice cracked the stillness again. "Michael, we don't want to hurt you. Just put the gun down." But Michael remained still, unmoving, his face blank, his gaze hollow. Everything inside him felt numb. The seconds stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, his fingers relaxed. Slowly, cautiously, the weapon slipped from his grip, falling to the ground with a dull thud. The officer stepped forward, his gun still raised, his expression unreadable. Michael didn't resist. He didn't even look up. His knees buckled beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground. The world was silent now. The door stood wide open, the wind gently blowing through the air. But there was no peace to be found in the quiet. And there would be no redemption for Michael Haight. The police moved in, cuffing him, their actions mechanical. But even as they took him away, his mind remained distant, lost in a sea of silence. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air, and there was no escaping it. It was over, and nothing would ever be the same again. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Michael's wrists, but he barely felt it. His body was like stone, unyielding, detached from the world around him. The officers led him away from the house, their footsteps sharp against the gravel. Each step felt like an eternity. His mind, though distant, replayed fragments, snapshots of moments, flashes of his family, their laughter, their joy. But it was all fading, slipping through his fingers like sand. The sirens that had once filled the air were now replaced by the eerie silence of his own thoughts. The sound of the handcuffs clinking as he was pushed into the back of the police car was deafening, yet still, he didn't move. His body didn't fight. It was as if something inside him had shut down completely. The car doors slammed shut, the sound reverberating in the stillness. The engine roared to life, and they sped away from the house, from the scene, from the wreckage of a family that would never be again. But no matter how fast they drove, Michael could still see it all in his mind. The blood on the floor, the lifeless bodies of his children, Tasha's face frozen in shock. He could still hear their screams, their pleas. But it was too late. The coldness inside him only grew stronger as the car carried him further from the scene. His future, whatever it had been, is now swallowed by the crushing weight of what he had done. The minutes dragged on, the world outside moving on without him. But inside, the world had stopped. The house, the family, everything that had once mattered was gone. And as the car sped towards the unknown, Michael Haight could only wonder if he could ever escape the echo of his own actions. But deep down, he knew it was futile, because there was no escape from the truth. And he was already lost. The journey felt endless, each mile stretching farther away from everything he had ever known. The lights of the city blurred by the window, the shadows dancing across the car's interior. Inside the cramped, silent space, Michael's thoughts were a jumbled mess. Images of his family flickered like a broken film reel. The way they had looked at him, the trust in their eyes. But it all felt distant now, like another life, another person. The car hummed along, its tires slicing through the night, but in Michael's mind, everything was frozen. He barely noticed the passing streets, the city lights, the blur of movement outside. His hands were still numb, still trapped in the cold embrace of the cuffs. The officer in the front seat glanced back, but Michael didn't react. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to feel. Time seemed to stretch, to bend, as though the minutes themselves were weighed down by the horror that clung to Michael. And then, as if the air itself was thick with the weight of his actions, he finally spoke. But the words that escaped his lips were barely a whisper. I couldn't stop myself. The officer in the front seat didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The truth was too clear. Michael's voice faltered, but his eyes remained fixed on the blank window, staring into the void. Outside, the world moved on, but for Michael, everything had ended. The destination ahead loomed, though he didn't want to face it. The police station, where he would finally be forced to face the consequences of what he had done. But deep inside he knew there would be no escape, no easy way out. Not from the memories. Not from the weight of the deaths he had caused. As the car neared the station, the sirens faded, replaced by the heavy silence that filled the space between him and the world outside. Michael felt the cold grip of inevitability. There was no redemption. There was no forgiveness. The doors of the car opened, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the station hit him. But it all felt distant, like he wasn't truly there. And as he was led toward the building, Michael couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly be able to escape the nightmare he had created. But deep down, he knew the answer. There was no escaping the horror. It would stay with him forever. The harsh lights of the station felt blinding as they ushered him inside. Michael's legs moved mechanically, each step echoing in the sterile, empty halls. The officers led him down a narrow corridor, the sound of their boots on the tile floor reverberating through the silence. He barely registered the faces of the officers as they passed, their expressions unreadable, cold. His mind was numb, disconnected from the world around him. Nothing seemed real. The reality of what he had done still hadn't fully settled in his chest. It felt like a dream, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But the concrete walls, the coldness of the station, the sharp buzz of the fluorescent lights, they were all real. They all screamed at him in a language he couldn't comprehend. They pushed him into a small, dimly lit holding cell. The door slammed shut behind him with a final, unforgiving clang. The sound echoed through the silence like a judgment. Michael stood there, frozen. His hands were still cuffed, still trembling. He could hear the distant murmur of voices outside the cell, the faint shuffle of footsteps, but they felt far away, as if he were trapped in some inescapable void, removed from the world he had once known. His eyes drifted to the corner of the cell. There was a small bench against the wall, but he didn't move toward it. Instead, his gaze wandered aimlessly, his mind unable to focus. The image of his wife's face, her eyes wide with confusion, flashed before him again. Tasha's voice, calling out to him, asking what was wrong. He could still hear it in his mind, echoing through the silence. The memory was suffocating. His throat tightened, and for a brief moment, he almost thought he could feel something. Regret? Guilt? But the feeling was fleeting, swallowed up by the numbness that seemed to have consumed him completely. The sound of footsteps grew louder outside the cell, but Michael didn't look up. He didn't care anymore. Nothing mattered now. The door to his cell opened, and a voice called out to him. "Michael Haight, you're being transferred." The words didn't register.
He didn't respond.
The officer in the doorway seemed to wait, but when there was no reaction, he stepped inside. It was time. Time for the next step in the process that had already begun. As Michael was escorted out, the door slammed shut behind him once more, locking him away from the world. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The consequences of his actions were now beyond his control. And for the first time, he truly understood that there was no escape. The cold metal door of the holding cell closed with an unyielding clang, sealing Michael in an even tighter cage. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound that filled the void. His thoughts remained distant, detached from the reality around him. The officer who had come to escort him led him down another hallway, the sound of his boots reverberating in the cold silence. Michael's own feet moved automatically, as though his body was on autopilot. He didn't care where they were taking him. The world outside could keep turning, but for Michael, everything had already stopped. The weight of his own actions hung over him like a storm cloud, suffocating, relentless. He had taken lives, his wife, his children, the very people who had once depended on him. And now, nothing remained. He was being led to a different place. Another room. Another cage. It was inevitable. As they reached the next set of doors, the officer in front stopped, turning to look at him. "Sit," he instructed in a calm, almost indifferent voice. Michael obeyed without thinking, dropping onto the cold metal bench in the room. His body felt like it was made of stone, stiff, unresponsive. The officer left, closing the door behind him, leaving Michael alone again. The silence was deafening now. It wrapped around him, drowning out everything, until all that remained was the sound of his own breath, shallow and ragged. What had he become? What kind of man could do what he had done? The questions clawed at him, but the answers never came. There was nothing left inside him. For the first time in his life, Michael truly understood what it meant to be lost. Not just to others, but to himself. Outside the room, he could hear the faint murmur of voices, the distant shuffle of feet. But they felt like noises from another world, too distant to reach him. And in the emptiness, a thought flitted across his mind, a cold whisper in the back of his skull. Would he ever be able to face the truth? Would he ever be able to understand why he had done it? But deep down, Michael knew the answer. He could never escape the weight of his choices. No matter how far he ran, the truth would always catch up to him. And as the minutes stretched on, the isolation wrapping itself tighter around him, he knew one thing for certain. He would never be free again. Days passed in that sterile, cold room. The walls closed in tighter with every passing hour. Michael sat on the bench, his body aching, his mind drifting between sharp clarity and hazy confusion. The days blurred together. There was no difference between the sunlight outside and the dark of the night. It was all the same, unbearably silent. At times, flashes of memory assaulted him. His children's laughter, Tasha's warm smile, their faces frozen in horror, eyes wide with terror, the last images he would ever have of them. They haunted him, but the feelings were distant, like watching a stranger's life on a screen. Nothing felt real anymore. The officers came and went. Sometimes they spoke to him, asked him questions, but Michael never answered. What was the point? What could he say? He was the monster, the man who had taken everything from them. And so he stayed silent. Then one day, the door to his cell opened again. This time, it wasn't an officer. It was a counselor, a woman, dressed in plain clothes, with a calm, neutral expression. She entered slowly, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "Michael," she said gently, sitting across from him, her eyes meeting his with an almost unsettling amount of compassion. "I'm here to talk."
He didn't respond.
He didn't even look at her. But she didn't push. She simply waited. The silence stretched for a long time before she spoke again, her voice soft but firm.
You don't have to speak.
But I'm here to listen. If you ever need to. Michael's gaze slowly lifted, locking with hers for the briefest of moments. It was the first time in days that he had truly looked at another person. But he still didn't speak. And for the first time in a long while, a thought slipped through the haze in his mind. Would it matter? Would anything he said change the truth of what he had done? But no matter how many times that thought circled in his mind, Michael didn't answer. There was no point, because he already knew the answer. And that was the hardest truth of all. Weeks passed, and the days melded into one long blur of silence and numbness. The walls of his small, cold cell became his only companions, their empty stare as constant as his own thoughts.
Michael didn't speak.
He didn't eat much. He barely slept. His mind replayed the events over and over, like a broken record, but the answers never came. The why, the how, the moment he crossed the line, none of it ever made sense. One morning, a guard came to his door and unlocked it. The time had come. Michael was led through a series of corridors, each step heavier than the last. The weight of the world pressed on his chest as they passed through the security checkpoints, out of the holding area, and into the final stage. The courtroom, the place where everything would be laid bare. But even then, as he stood before the judge, surrounded by lawyers, the eyes of the public piercing into him, Michael felt nothing. No fear, no regret, just the hollow, empty weight of what he had done. The charges were read aloud, the names of his victims, his family, echoing in the sterile air. But Michael didn't move. He didn't flinch. There was no plea, no defense, no apology. Just a man who had already abandoned himself long before the trial began. And when the sentence was handed down, when the gavel struck, sealing his fate, there was no relief, no sense of closure, just more silence. In the weeks that followed, Michael was transferred to a maximum security prison. The world outside continued on, indifferent to his existence. But inside, he was just another inmate, just another name in the system. The once familiar faces of his family were now ghosts in his mind. The memories were all he had left. And even they began to fade, slipping into the abyss of time. He had become nothing, a shadow of the man he used to be. And in the end, that was all he was ever meant to be.